Tech Horizon, episode 203. I'm Marcus Quillum.
And I'm Jane Beaumont. And if you're just joining us for the first time, we're a weekly podcast that dives into the latest tech trends and how they're reshaping our world.
And boy, do we have a bombshell to discuss today. Just 2 days ago, Apple dropped what might be the most significant announcement in tech since they unveiled the original iPhone back in 2007.
That's right. Apple has officially announced plans to phase out cellular phones completely by 2034. Not just iPhones, all cellular phones. It's either the boldest vision of the future I've ever heard, or the most audacious corporate strategy. I'm still processing it, to be honest.
Same here. And before we dive in, I want to thank all of you for tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, take a quick second to leave us a comment or hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us and helps other tech-curious folks find our little corner of the podcast universe.
And a special shout out to everyone who's been blowing up our community forum since the announcement. We see your comments, and we'll be addressing many of your questions throughout today's episode.
So Jane, when Apple CEO Aurora Chen took the stage at their Cupertino headquarters and said, "This is not the end, it's a transformation," I nearly spilled my coffee. Did you see this coming?
Not exactly, though we did speculate in episode 187 that something major was brewing at Apple. But a complete phase-out of the iPhone? That's bold even for Apple. Though I will say, the signs have been there if you've been paying attention to their product roadmap.
Absolutely. The Vision Pro, the AirPods Max, the new Neural Band. They've been building an ecosystem that's less dependent on screens for years now. But let's break down what Apple actually announced. They outlined 3 main drivers behind this decision: technological evolution, changing user behavior, and environmental responsibility.
Right. And they've laid out this 3-phase plan spanning from 2025 to 2034. It starts with integrating non-phone communication capabilities into their ecosystem, then gradually phasing out cellular dependence, and finally completing the migration to what they're calling a post-phone world.
I gotta say, I'm genuinely excited about the technological possibilities here. Apple talked about neural input systems, voice-responsive AI embedded in everyday objects, and spatial interaction through AR lenses and even contact lens displays. It's like science fiction coming to life.
Slow down there, tech optimist. While I agree the technology is fascinating, I have serious questions about accessibility. Not everyone is going to be comfortable with neural interfaces or wearing AR contact lenses. And what about the elderly or those with certain disabilities?
Fair point. Though Apple did emphasize that accessibility would remain core to their approach. I think what's most interesting is how they're responding to the way our relationship with smartphones has evolved. They cited studies showing we're hitting what they called a smartphone plateau, where innovation has slowed and user experience hasn't fundamentally changed in years.
That's actually the part of their announcement I found most compelling. The data showing declining active phone usage versus passive consumption is something we've been talking about for years on this show. Remember our digital well-being episode?
Episode 176. That was a popular one.
Exactly. People are increasingly reporting screen fatigue and digital overload. My favorite stat from Apple's presentation was that the average person spends over 4 hours daily on their smartphone, but only about 12 minutes of that is actually making calls or sending personal messages.
It reminds me of my nephew, who's 16. When I call him, he never picks up. But send him a voice message on any of the dozen apps he uses, and he responds instantly. The concept of a phone call is already becoming antiquated for Gen Z.
That's a great example. And Apple seems to be betting that by moving away from the traditional smartphone model, they can create healthier digital environments that still keep us connected, but without the addictive qualities of current devices.
What surprised me most was actually the environmental angle. Apple committed to reducing their device output by 60% by 2034. That's huge for a company whose business model has been built on selling new devices every year.
I was skeptical about that part, to be honest. Is this genuine sustainability or clever marketing? Because transitioning to wearables and ambient computing still requires manufacturing physical products, many using the same rare earth materials and components as smartphones.
True, but if these new devices have longer lifespans and are more modular, the net impact could be positive. I'm curious how this might intersect with the right-to-repair movement we've covered before.
Good question. Apple has historically been resistant to right-to-repair initiatives, but a more modular approach that seemed to align better with repairability. I guess we'll see if this represents a true philosophical shift or just a rebranding of planned obsolescence.
Speaking of reactions, the industry response has been fascinating to watch. Samsung basically said, "Thanks but no thanks" to Apple's vision, insisting that smartphones remain indispensable tools for billions.
While Google was surprisingly supportive, their blog post practically applauded Apple, saying the future of connectivity is not about devices, it's about experiences. Though, according to my sources, there's been plenty of emergency meetings happening across Silicon Valley since the announcement.
I bet, and telecom providers must be sweating bullets. Their entire business model is built around cellular plans and mobile infrastructure. AT&T and Verizon have been conspicuously quiet so far.
That's because they're scrambling to figure out how to pivot. A former colleague of mine, who now works at one of the major carriers, texted me right after the announcement and just said, "Well, there goes my 5-year plan."
I can imagine. So who do you think follows Apple's lead here? Google seems the most likely candidate, given their investments in ambient computing and AI assistance.
Probably, though I think they'll take a more gradual approach. Microsoft might actually be better positioned for this transition with their mixed reality focus. The companies I expect to resist most are the Chinese manufacturers like Xiaomi and Oppo, who've built their businesses on affordable smartphones for global markets.
That raises an interesting point about the global implications. We're talking about this from our very Western, tech-saturated perspective. But for many people around the world, smartphones represent their first and only computing device, their financial system, their connection to education and opportunity.
Exactly. The digital divide could actually widen if we're suddenly expecting people to adopt expensive wearables and neural interfaces instead of relatively affordable smartphones. Not everyone has the privilege of being an early adopter.
That's a really important point. And then there's the emotional aspect. Our listeners have been blowing up our community forum with reactions. Silicon Sally wrote, "My iPhone is practically an extension of my body at this point. I can't imagine life without it."
And Tech Trekker commented, "I met my wife on a dating app. I run my business from my phone. I navigate everywhere with it. What happens to all of that?"
These are valid concerns. We've developed deep relationships with these devices. They hold our memories, our connections, our work lives. There's going to be resistance to giving that up, no matter how cool the alternative might be. There's a lot to consider.
And then there are the privacy implications. Moving to ambient computing and neural interfaces means potentially having technology that's always listening, always watching, always connected to our thoughts. That's a level of intimacy with technology that makes me deeply uncomfortable.
Apple did emphasize that privacy would remain a core value, with data staying on device rather than in the cloud. But you're right. The privacy questions here are profound and complex.
And let's not forget that Apple is still a publicly traded company with shareholders to please. This transition has to make business sense. They're not doing this purely for the technological wonder of it all.
True. Though Apple's stock actually jumped 7% after the announcement, so investors seem cautiously optimistic. But stepping back for a moment, Isn't there something poetic about Apple, the company that defined the smartphone era, now declaring its end?
It is poetic, and it shows a willingness to cannibalize their own success that few companies have. Remember when Steve Jobs said, "If you don't cannibalize yourself, someone else will." This seems to be that philosophy taken to its logical extreme.
When the iPhone launched in 2007, it completely transformed how we live, work, communicate, even how we fall in love. Do you think whatever comes next will have that same level of impact?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The smartphone was revolutionary because it consolidated so many separate tools into one device. What Apple's proposing now is almost the opposite, distributing those functions across an ecosystem of wearables and ambient technology.
It's like we're moving from the Swiss Army knife approach back to having specialized tools. But those tools are now interconnected and often invisible.
Exactly. And that could be liberating in many ways. Imagine not having to pull out your phone every 5 minutes because the information you need is delivered exactly when and how you need it, without interrupting your flow of life.
I love that vision. Though I do wonder if we'll look back at smartphones with nostalgia someday. Remember when we used to carry around these little glass rectangles?
Probably. Just like how people now collect vinyl records and film cameras. There might be a retro smartphone movement in 2050.
I can see the hipster cafes now. Vintage iPhone night. Bring your iPhone 15 and swipe like it's 2023. Oh.
I'd actually go to that. But as we wrap up, I think the biggest takeaway is that whether Apple succeeds or fails with this vision, they've started a conversation that the tech industry can't ignore. The post-smartphone era is coming. The only question is when and how.
Absolutely. And we'll be tracking this story as it develops. Next week, we're actually going to be speaking with a former Apple executive who worked on the early iPhone team to get their perspective on this announcement.
That's going to be fascinating, and we want to hear from you, our listeners. How do you feel about Apple's vision of a post-phone future? Would you be willing to give up your smartphone for neural interfaces and ambient computing? Share your thoughts in our community forum.
And with that, we'll wrap up episode 203 of the Tech Horizon. I'm Marcus Quillum.
And I'm Jane Beaumont. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week as we continue to explore the ever-changing landscape of technology and its impact on our lives.
Take care, everyone.